The debate I often find around capacity market versus energy only market somewhat reductive, just because this design piece is so crucial and thinking through how the capacity market fits into the broader system. There's just a huge difference between a UK style system where you get 15-year government-backed contracts and you build that allows for low cost of capital versus a bilateral auction with 1-year head contract and no price transparency where, you've got to think about interaction with other policies at the same time.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora. And today, I'm going to be undertaking a capacity market deep dive with some of Aurora's leadership from around the world. We're going to be asking, what are capacity markets? Why are they used? And when do they work? Now, the context for this podcast really focuses on markets outside Europe. In Europe, capacity markets have largely won the debate. They exist in the UK, in Ireland, in France, Poland, Italy, shortly in Spain. The conversation in Germany never seems to die. And so the capacity market conversation in Europe, it seems to suffer a little bit from the narcissism of small differences, where you get these violent debates over minutiae like penalty levels or demand procurement or these types of things. But outside of Europe, there are live debates. In Australia, it's the government's preferred policy, arguably. In Texas, there's a debate about how to keep the lights on after Storm Uri a couple of years ago. And the drivers are fairly well known. In these markets, renewables penetration is rising. And so at certain hours of the year, electricity is very cheap and certainly not high enough for thermal plant, a dispatchable plant to make a lot of money. Coal is closing, often driven by that renewables penetration or broader environmental regulations, but investment in new dispatchable capacity is failing to keep up with the closures. And often in these markets in which capacity markets are being considered, there's a history of excess capacity margins that is being whittled down. Now, sometimes it takes a disaster or a blackout to trigger the debate around capacity mechanisms, as we've seen in ERCOT, and as we're arguably seeing in some markets in Europe at the moment. So today's episode focuses on those listeners in those markets that are thinking about capacity markets as a solution to reliability in electricity markets. And we've assembled the great and the good of Aurora to cover this topic. So if I could introduce my panelists today. First of all, we have Aurora's MD for GB and Ireland, Dan Monzani. Welcome, Dan.
Hi, John. And
I would add that Dan, formerly, as part of the British government, oversaw or was heavily involved in the capacity market there. And Dan is joining us from Oxford in the UK. Joining us from California is Aurora's MD for Asia Pacific and California, Hugo Batten. Welcome, Hugo.
Hi, John.
And finally, joining us from Austin, Texas, we have Aurora's head of US, Oliver Kerr. Welcome, Oliver.
Glad to be here.
Excellent. And I'm joining from New York City. I don't have my usual microphone, which might explain the slight difference in recording quality here. Now, before we jump into the content, there's a few caveats. So first of all, this will be a bit technical. Now, Energy Unplugged is never afraid to be technical, but the capacity market is a highly technical area of the power market. And so, buckle in. There could be some numbers and some concepts thrown around. And then finally, and really importantly, Aurora's role is not to take policy positions. We're not here to advocate any particular thing. We are humble energy modelers. So the spirit of the session is robust debate, where we bring personal views to the table, not necessarily Aurora's. In general, I think a recognition that modeling is a wonderful way to understand the electricity system, but it is not the only way to understand it. And any capacity market exists in a broader social, political, economic context. And so what may be the right answer in one circumstance or in one particular theoretical construct may not be the answer everywhere. So let's start with Dan. Simple. What sounds like a simple question, Dan. What are capacity markets?
Well, I'll keep the answer simple initially, at least. I think there's a couple of elements that define a capacity market rather than other forms of security of supply. One, and most obviously, is you're paying for capacity and not for energy. So in an energy-only market, you have to make your investment back to pay for the original capacity through what you can sell your power for. In a capacity market, you separately get paid for that capacity and then are also able to operate in the energy market. The second thing is it's across the whole market, so it's accessible to all players in the market, unlike a strategic reserve where you're trying to pick out the people who are uneconomic and only support them. And then there's a couple of other elements that I think might be debatable, but I'd say it's centrally administered rather than devolved to retailers, for example. So it's the sort of system operator or the government that determines how much you need and runs it, and it's a market. So it's not a predefined payment of a particular level that's set. It's a market that determines the price.
Excellent, thanks, Dan. And that's a really helpful taxonomy. So, in a sense, defining by what it's not, a capacity market, a system with a capacity market is not an energy-only market. It's not a strategic reserve market. It's not a retail obligation market. It's something slightly different. And these are the sorts of options policymakers tend to consider when they think about how to keep the lights on in any particular power system. Okay, so we've started broad, and I really like the definition, Dan. There are, of course, thousands of moving pieces within any of these. And I just want to ask the panelists about some of those. So one of the things that a policymaker might need to decide on is eligible technologies. How do you think about those? How do they impact the capacity market? Yeah.
Yes, that's a great question. I mean, now the purist would say absolutely you should have everybody in a capacity market because that's the point. That's part of my definition. And generally, therefore, you'd set emissions limits in the energy market. After all, capacity doesn't emit any carbon. It's burning fossil fuels that emits carbon, and that's usually done when people are producing energy. And that's certainly where the UK capacity market started, allowing everybody in on a broadly equal basis. However, the debate's moved on both in the UK and in other places. For example, should you exclude the most emitting technologies like coal? And the UK has done that, although I would note it only did it after the point at which it had legislated to close coal and prevent it operating in the energy market. So it had to exclude it because it was obvious it couldn't provide capacity. Debate's also moving on to whether you might split these capacity markets between clean technologies and other technologies. So you first of all get a determined amount of clean technology that can provide firm capacity and only then allow others. And that's a way of, I think, splitting the price more than excluding people because it allows you not to give the high price to gas and coal.
Just to jump in here, I think in Australia, this is a very live debate. So you've got the federal government, thinking through the rules of the capacity market, but at least the current thinking is that states will determine the eligible technologies. Victoria, the southern state Australia, is saying they do not potentially want coal or gas to participate. The challenge is then they're likely to import a lot of coal-generated megawatt hours through interconnectors, particularly from New South Wales, and then how will those be treated? So where you have integrated systems with differing eligible technologies, I imagine it gets very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, and one way you might simplify that, Hugo, is the way a number of European markets have, which is to restrict technologies based on emissions per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour. Is it half a ton per megawatt hour? Then you can be in like a modern CCGT, or if it's over a ton of a megawatt hour of CO2, then you're out like a coal plant. That makes it slightly simpler, but it is still in that world in which you're using a capacity market to achieve both an environmental and a security objective, and it does complicate things.
I think that does raise a broader point around how capacity markets fit into the broader sort of policy landscape. So, in one other way to think about it is, does a capacity market need to do everything, or do you have another policy mechanism like a carbon price to deal with the environmental piece, and you have a capacity market more strictly and narrowly designed for system security?
Yeah, for sure. So that's eligible technologies. Another key one, Dan, is procurement targets. So one of the differences between capacity markets and energy-only markets is an energy-only market, you don't set a procurement target. You let the market drive it. But in a capacity market, someone will have to decide, okay, it's a 57 gigawatt peak was the highest we ever had. So let's procure 60 gigawatts of capacity. How do you think about procurement targets?
Yeah, this is often very technical, but where an awful lot of the real decisions are made. So I think there's a couple of things here. Firstly, who takes the decision? Secondly, how are they advised? And thirdly, how transparent is that process? So your options, I think, are broadly three in who takes the decision if it's a centralized system. I'll just sort of mention France in passing in a second. In a centralized system, you've basically got a government minister or ministry, a regulator, or a system operator. Now, you would expect politicians to have to be very clearly advised on the technical side of that. So very likely they're going to get their advice from a system operator, as they do in the UK and other European countries. It's often helpful to augment that with an independent panel. That's certainly the UK experience, not least because it sort of narrows the range of sensible decisions that can be made there. I think it's also really important that's transparent and it's clear why people are taking decisions. I mean, a frequent criticism, which we may come on to later, is that capacity markets tend to over-procure. And I think in my observation would be, whoever's taking those decisions, the risks always look skewed towards not letting the lights go out because it's your name on the decision. And so I think sort of trying to put as much of a set of advice around that tends to be where the decision making design is, if you like, the design for who takes what decision. Having said that, there's still then a series of technical methodologies for how you decide what your risks are. I don't suggest we go through all of the sort of minutiae of that, but it is actually quite an ongoing process of trying to understand what might happen in a market. What are the things that are plausible and not just imaginable, and making sure that you're setting a margin that is somewhat above what you're expecting peak demand to be, but not necessarily trying to chase every risk.
Dan, I think the other important thing in target setting, increasingly, and this is front of mind for Australia, is it's not just the peak gigawatts, but it's also the duration that you will need those for. So, in a weather-dependent system where we're thinking about Dunkelflautes and those types of issues, traditionally, I think we've thought in like 2 or 4 hour, that's how long we'll need that peak demand. We've done a lot of work around residual demand and, i.e. demand that's not met by renewable output. And there's at least a portion of that is going to need to be much longer than 4 hours in the Australian context. And so you've got the peak, but you've also got the length. And from what I've seen of policymakers globally, they haven't started to really grapple with both of those axes. They do through derating factors, but it's a crude instrument to think through a complex problem, I think.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Hugo. And those are your tools. You try and account for it in your demand, but you have to aim at one number. You've got to set one procurement target, and therefore it inevitably is a kind of peak gigawatts. Perhaps that's sort of worth expanding on that point about derating approaches, because that is the other way in which you try and take account of whether or not your supply is able to meet the actual stress event that you might get. And there's sort of all sorts of ways people have approached derating. The classical one is basically to assume it's a gas plant that is doing your peak demand in the way you just described as being sort of a little bit old school, but nonetheless you sort of derate for the technical availability based on historical time series, and that's fine if the historical time series works well. But of course, not everything's going to be the same in the future as it was in the past. And if you look at some of the performance of coal or even nuclear in places like the UK and France, as it's got towards the end of its life, actually its performance has dipped, particularly nuclear actually. And so there's different approaches that different countries have taken towards the end of life. The other one I think is duration, as you say, and actually I remember in the UK getting this quite wrong, in that we had, purely because we hadn't seen the amount of batteries that were going to deploy on the system coming, and so they were all treated as storage, and storage was based on the historical performance of pumped storage, which was somewhere around 96%. Now, a half-hour battery doesn't really give you the same coverage of a potentially 4 or 8 hour stress event, or as you say, a much longer duration one. So some of the grappling with that was to sort of derate more aggressively by duration. As you say, though, I'm not sure it fully yet incorporates that sort of multi-day drop in winds.
Dan, it does feel a bit like there's some potential downside here for batteries. I mean, Oliver experienced Storm Uri in Texas. This was at least a 2-day outage with gigawatts and gigawatts missing. A 4-hour duration battery cannot provide power for more than 4 hours. And so there's something that feels fundamentally different. And I'm not sure I've seen differential treatment in the capacity markets I've seen globally that just reflects the fact that, you pay for the CCGT to be there. And as long as the spark spread is positive, it will be generating electricity throughout the whole period. I don't know if you had any reflections on that, Oliver.
I think that's exactly right. And what you saw in Storm Uri is that a bunch of batteries had sold capacity ahead in ancillary service markets. They weren't able to provide that consistently throughout the storm, and you saw those batteries then dropping out of the market. In that sort of long multi-hour system stress event, it's not just a 1, 2, or even 4-hour battery that you need. It's something that can generate for like you said, up to several days, and that's what we see increasing going forward as renewable share of generation increases.
Just to follow up, so okay, everyone knows batteries have a limited duration, unlike a gas plant or a coal plant or a nuclear plant. One of the things batteries do provide, though, that some of those other plants don't, is flexibility. The lights go out and batteries can be on in a fraction of a second, compared to, say, a coal plant, which might take half a day or something like that. Oliver, do you see any circumstances under which you think rewarding the speed of flexibility through a capacity market is sensible, in the same way we've discussed punishing carbon emissions?
Yeah, I think this is similar to the point that Hugo just made around duration. It's not just simple capacity that matters. In a world where you do have, or in a market where you do have increasing share of renewable generation, system flexibility is also really important, and that speed of response can become very important. So, if you have a simple reserve margin of however many gigawatts, but that's all inflexible nuclear and some CCGT, and you've got 30 gigawatts of solar coming offline every evening as the sun goes down, do you need to be thinking a bit harder around building flexibility requirements specifically into capacity markets? Now, the counter argument would be that that is best dealt with in other places, either through price signals in the energy market or ancillary markets typically. But you could conceive of a world where you start to build system flexibility more explicitly into capacity market design.
Yeah, okay, thanks. I'll move us on, but it's just a reflection we might pick up later. It does feel like a key policy decision is, what is this capacity market here for? And at the broadest perspective, it is, we want to procure dispatchable, available, low carbon, flexible generation, in which case you're going to have a pretty complicated capacity market with a whole bunch of parameters. Or there's another version, which is, we're here to buy gigawatts, and we're going to need some other policies that are there to achieve our environmental goals, like a carbon price, or our flexibility goals, like a rich set of ancillary services markets, for example. But that seems like a fairly fundamental design principle based on what you've said.
Can I just add to that very briefly? I think the debate I often find around capacity market versus energy only market somewhat reductive, just because this design piece is so crucial, and thinking through how the capacity market fits into the broader system. There's just a huge difference between a UK style system where you get a 15-year government-backed contract for new build that allows for a low cost of capital versus a bilateral auction with 1-year head contract and no price transparency, where you've got to think about interaction with other policies at the same time. So I'm glad, John, you've opened the discussion with some of these design elements, which I think are fundamental to the bigger debate.
a couple of design elements, maybe they're less fundamental to the policy, but are around penalty regimes. So what happens if you take a contract but don't deliver, and length of contracts, as you've touched on. Am I bidding to provide capacity in winter? Am I bidding it to provide it all year round? Am I bidding to provide it for the next 15 years, as is the case for new build in Great Britain? Hugo, what are you seeing in this space? How do you think about the trade-offs here?
Yeah, and it's certainly been salient in Australia, where the prices have been insanely high, and indeed the market's actually had to be shut down for the first time ever across the whole eastern seaboard because prices have been so high. And the argument has been, well, look, the wholesale market with a price cap of 15 grand provides a pretty painful incentive if you don't rock up at times of system stress. And indeed, because some of these old coal plants are less reliable, they haven't rocked up, and some of the utilities have taken billion-dollar write-downs as a result. So there are different ways to do penalties. My understanding of the GB market, it's been a while since I looked at it, was that you basically didn't get paid if you didn't rock up. And there weren't kind of punitive penalties. John, you and I did quite an influential bit of work looking at derating of interconnectors and saying that if, like, France or Ireland was having system stress events at the same time as GB, because there were penalties in those capacity markets, I think from memory, you might see power actually flowing away on interconnectors during simultaneous system stress events. So, penalty regimes, they don't matter until they really do, but do require some thought. And I think there should be a bit of a stick there if you don't rock up at times that you've said you will. In terms of length of contracts, I mean, in some ways, the whole point of a capacity market is to bring down the cost of capital for gigawatts and provide stable long-term contracts that allow debt to be got into these projects. And that's certainly one of the upsides we'll get to. So, UK, but also I think Australia, from what has come out, is looking at kind of, 10, 15-year contracts. And so, I kind of assume that's the norm globally, and it seems to make sense if that's the broader intention of capacity markets.
Could I just jump in there on the penalty regimes? Because you're right to distinguish the two different types. Essentially, one might be characterised as being penalised by missing the opportunity cost of selling into the wholesale market. The other by having an actual penalty for not delivering. And if policymakers believed they were really brutally effective, then some of the other things would matter less, like derating factors. You could essentially say derate yourself, but you're carrying a really big risk if you don't deliver. So it's clear that sort of actual turning up penalty regime is there to sharpen the focus rather than to do all of the heavy lifting without the wholesale market. And that must be right, because stress events actually don't come around that often. So you can't be relied on people anticipating pain if it's a 1 in 10 year event. So I briefly want to mention the other type of penalty, which is the capacity not actually being there. Not so much it doesn't perform when it's needed, but it's broken and it's not fixed, and that's where in the UK that's got a lot harsher. And so if you take a contract, a new build contract, and you don't deliver it, or if you close an existing plant that's got an agreement prematurely, that's when there are some quite serious penalties up to around £35 a kilowatt. And that sort of means that the discipline is perhaps harsher on the does the capacity get to the starting gate than how it performs in the market at the time.
And Dan, you touched on, I think, quite an important nuance here that I was going to mention when we were talking about procurement targets as well. And I think there's often the sort of criticism of capacity markets of like government getting further into energy markets in setting a procurement target. But of course, when you think about it, the act of, and certainly an energy only market doesn't set a target gigawatts in the system, but setting the price cap is isomorphic in a sense. It is the choice of what the price is when you have lost load should determine how much capacity you have in that market in a sort of mathematical sense. The more money I get when there's lost load, the more spare capacity I have. If you get infinity money when the lights go out, I suspect you'll have a lot of people building in. So in a sense, the communist aspect of the capacity market and the government getting more involved is not about the procurement target, because I think the act of setting a price cap in a power market is, in a very clear mathematical way, the same act of intervention. Where I think you get deeper intervention is in derating factors. And of course, a more free market approach to a capacity market would say derate yourself. And if you're not there, either forego some energy market revenue or we're going to have some sort of penalty. And so that would decentralize some of the decision making. But I think it's an important nuance there. So I appreciate you raising it.
I would also say that there's a difference between the sort of economically rational answer and how we see markets actually behaving and sort of what discount rate are people applying to prices at that cap. I mean, if the discount rate's 100, you could have an infinite 100%, then you can have an infinite price and still not see capacity turning up. And I think that probably explains some of the challenges we've seen in Texas in incentivizing new generation to come forward, at least in the short term.
Yeah. It's a really good point about long-term contracts and the value of regular cash flows. Just one other aspect of design I want to talk on. Then I want to sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about the political context in which these things arise. But there's a question down around sort of timing and frequency of auctions. How do you see the trade-offs there?
There's two points I want to make here. One is about planning horizons, and the other is about gaming potential. So in the UK, and I think this is sort of broadly replicated across Europe, there's a T-4 and a T-1 auction. So 4 years ahead and 1 year ahead, roughly speaking. The 4 years was set basically as the period it would take to build a new CCGT, and fortuitously quite a lot of other capacity can build within that time frame as well. But I would note not all forms of capacity, so it takes longer to build pump storage. So that choice of lead time is not entirely optimal. There's choice in there, and you want a lead time that allows new to compete with existing for obvious reasons. Better competition, better price discovery, and it allows the exit of the high carbon technologies as well as entry of cleaner technologies. You need a T-1 because nobody has got perfect foresight of what demand's going to be, or indeed what's going to break between the 4 year ahead point and the year ahead point. So a top-up auction to true up before the auctions usually needed. I think an evolution from the British model across Europe has been more flexibility about holding T-3 or 2 auctions. I think that's learned experience of actually, once you've got a capacity market, one of the risks is that people who haven't won start exiting quicker than you hoped, and you can find yourself actually having a capacity crunch before the delivery year. In GB, we ended up having at very short notice a sort of whole market 1 year ahead auction precisely because of that. And we've seen things like in Ireland where they didn't get the capacity they needed, introducing a T-3 auction in order to true that up. But that comes to my second point. If you're not pretty clear about when you're going to do them, there's a risk of people gaming you and causing the furthest ahead market not to clear in order to corner later markets. So those are the kind of factors you need to get in. How do you give enough sight ahead of time to get competition, but leave yourself space to true up nearer time? And how do you avoid that turning into a gaming potential and power for large players in the system?
Dan, you touched on one thing. Why treat new plant and existing plant differently in a capacity mechanism? So PJM doesn't, right? PJM holds 3 years ahead, and it says, look, of course you can build a new plant, and plenty of people have. And when you're here, we'll give you a capacity market if you're available that summer. But otherwise you don't get it. What's the best argument for treating new and existing capacity differently?
So they're treating differently in the sense that you can get in Europe, you can get different contract lengths, but you get the same price. I suppose that what that implies, and therefore the reason why you might do it differently, is that they're competing on a level basis, that somehow that same price has exited the right people and brought in the new people. But there's no magic to why it's 15 years rather than 10 years or 12 years. So to some extent, there's an administered equivalence. And I suppose it's more honest to separate those out and say, well, we'll just say how much new capacity we want and do it that way. And then we'll let the existing capacity compete for the rest. The risk there, of course, is, do you really know how much optimal new capacity you want? You might know how much new clean capacity you want, but do you really know whether it's optimal to keep a peaking gas plant going for another year, or to build a brand new CCGT?
I'm just treating them the same, basically. You're saying, I don't care how shiny the capacity is. I'll pay you. You just got to be in the cheapest 60 gigawatts when we hold the auction.
John, I think that the concern and why they want to separate, or at least some people want to separate new and existing in Australia, is because there is not good carbon policy. A capacity market therefore becomes a way to keep in old coal plants longer than they otherwise might, and crowds out both renewables and new dispatchable capacity. So I think, like the UK, if you've got really quite well designed carbon pricing and all the infrastructure around that, sure, treat them the same. But a capacity market without that stuff is perceived, at least, to be backdoor payments to coal.
Yeah. Another reason for splitting that out, whether you split it new existing or clean dirty, is the point I made earlier about price. You might, if you've got basically two big separate clusters of price required, then you might want to split those in order to make sure you're price discriminating, essentially.
John, just before we do jump onto the politics, one other kind of design point. I do think there is quite radical differences between centralized and decentralized capacity markets. So the UK, very centralized, very transparent. California, their resource adequacy system, capacity payments administered through load serving entities, pay as bid, so kind of bilateral contracts effectively, and very untransparent. And so you kind of hear rumors. Did you hear what X got for their 15-year RA payment? Oh, it was really juicy, and that kind of then sets debates and for a little while. They are quite radically different approaches. Each have their pros and cons. And Dan might argue that the latter isn't even a capacity market. But it seems to work in California. It does bring on new capacity, but worth considering those as well in design choice discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I would call that a retail obligation, but I'm constantly surprised at sort of how much stock Americans put in opaque markets. In a sense, it's sort of and you get these funny things. Maybe that's just me as the bias towards being a modeler and wanting access to the data, but it does seem odd that people think you should keep these things that non-published. There's a rule about 60 days. You can't publish power plant generation information for 60 days in general, which seems slightly odd as well. Anyway, let's talk about the political context. One of the points up front was, okay, so we've gone kind of mechanically through these features and discussed them. They're sort of the key design choices. But of course, politics, and we've talked about the economic merits, but politics impact all of these decisions. So that a broad question, like, in what ways does the political context matter?
I mean, the biggest political context here, and where capacity markets matter, is if you've committed to decarbonisation, because the politics of trying to do that level of transition is really difficult. And as we're seeing throughout this winter, there's been questions around security of supply in many markets, questions about affordability. So if you can try and neutralise one of those, then that tends to be the political context in which they start arising. Now, there's an economic reason for that as well, because it starts to erode the margins for gas. But I think the politics of just being able to take a crisis off the table as far as is humanly possible tends to be a really important political context for it. There's a sort of, I think Oliver made this point before, but it's a sort of political economy point about how you manage your way through those transitions, and whether or not your capacity market is seen as the solution to everything, or whether it's part of a suite of measures that are part of your market design, so that you're clear that this is the capacity bit, and you're doing other things to sharpen up signals in other markets, whether that's for location or for flexibility. So those are a couple of the political contexts. It's always politically controversial, though, introducing a capacity market, and it's generally seen as being from somewhere else. I mean, it certainly was seen like that when it first came into the UK, and then I think the rest of Europe felt it was a UK thing, and we're seeing some of that playing out in Australia, I suspect, at the moment. But as I say, once they're established, I think the advantage from a politician's point of view is that they've got a mechanism that allows them to neutralise one of the really complicated and difficult things during such a big turnover of the capital stock.
I might just add on that, and to Oliver's point about sometimes these slightly reductive debates, often they're portrayed as capacity markets versus energy markets. But I think from what I've seen, you rarely see a pure energy only market. Australia has a capacity market. It's just extremely disorganized and ad hoc. And it basically takes the form of government, federal or state, all their bodies, green banks or arena, chucking money towards projects in fairly opaque and untransparent ways. So there's very little dispatchable capacity that's been built over the last decade in Australia that hasn't got some form of government subsidy, whether that be concessional financing or direct grants. So the kind of puritative debate in academic articles often disguises the reality on the ground. The other thing I'd say to your point is capacity markets do seem to come out of crises. Like, in the UK, from memory, it was the sun kind of screaming about how the lights were going to go off every winter. In Australia, it's the whole kind of closure of the market, which is giving the minister, Chris Bowen, a bit of a license to explore capacity markets and potentially deliver one. So it is rare that these are products of like well-defined policy processes. Like a crisis happens, politicians want to be seen to be doing something. It's arguable whether capacity markets are even the solution to the problem that's being experienced at the time, but they are something. They give politicians kind of a lever to pull, and therefore they're executed. So I think that is important context as well.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Hugo. I mean, before the capacity market in the UK, I would say, look, a coal plant will say, it's sort of there. It says it's closing twice before it actually closes, in a sense, and it was sort of there was brinkmanship with government, and you see it in Australia, Victorian government giving some of the coal generators a bunch of money at the moment to stick around. You see it in Texas. We've never seen the sorts of payments that we're seeing for ancillary services as we're sitting in the run up to the gubernatorial election coming up later this year. And so, you've got a capacity market in one shape or form. It's just is it opaque or is it transparent? I would say, and I think the British government, since the introduction of the capacity market, there have been asset owners who have sort of said, hey, well, we're going to close. And I think the easy response is, well, you should compete in the capacity market. And if you get a contract, you should stick around. And if you don't, then you shouldn't. But either way, we're pretty comfortable with the situation. I suppose the other policy context, which you didn't quite touch on, Dan, is and we've talked about it already, so I won't go into detail, but is that kind of broader decarbonisation agenda. And, as I say, I think probably the biggest resistance to the capacity mechanism in a number of the market in Australia, as we're seeing it now in the UK, is, hang on, this is going to keep a bunch of assets around for a long time. And so landing the policy within that context is actually really important. There's actually some legal action around the UK one in the European courts around demand response, and are we keeping coal around at the expense of demand? So that's a pretty common political context.
And one more point I'd make on the politics, John. I think people like us, academics, policymakers, like these capacity market debates because they're interesting. But Dan said this a few different times. It's not a solution to every problem. So I think while politicians might debate capacity markets, there's a lot of extremely important tactical stuff that we can crack on with to alleviate a lot of the problems that we're experiencing, for example, in Australia, things like connection lead times, how long and expensive transmission takes to build. Like, that's at least equally important as capacity markets, if not more so, but tend to get lost because they're not quite such clean policy debates, I think.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to jump to a sort of, create a little bit more debate here and focus on sort of the best reasons one might adopt the capacity market or one might criticize a capacity market. So maybe I'll call on each of you and maybe just fire away with what your best argument is. So maybe Oliver, to start with you, what would you say is your key strength of a capacity market?
I think for me personally, I think that a well-designed capacity market feels like a much more stable policy. So I think one of the challenges in a world with high renewables, and maybe this is just a fundamental contradiction at the heart of pure energy-only markets, is that you need scarcity to incentivize new investment. But scarcity, at least persistent scarcity, is politically intolerable. So no government can plausibly commit to maintain an energy-only market over time, and a capacity market that is sort of, you define the rules, you set procurement targets in advance, is probably the best protection against knee-jerk policy reactions like Hugo was just talking about whenever the lights go out. I think that's the strongest argument from my perspective.
Okay, so protection from knee-jerks. Hugo, what would be up towards the top of your list?
Yeah, well, I think that's the obvious stuff. Like, it does bring down the cost of capital for new entrants because you get long-term contracts while retaining competitive tension. And that stuff is obvious. For me, there's some non-obvious stuff. Like in the UK, it seemed to allow like smaller, agile players, the UKPRs, the green frogs, to emerge, to build smaller, gas recips, batteries, and distribution networks but also to get debt into those projects. And critically in Australia, and it's a structure of the T-1, T-4, it doesn't just give you transparency on new entry, but it gave you transparency on exit as well. And that's something that Australia is really struggling with. We know these coal plants are coming out. Some may exit much earlier than forecast. At the moment, they're obliged to give 3 years notice, but there's no real penalties for not doing that. And why should we expect gentailers to run plants that are no longer profitable? So that was, to me, I think, quite a non-obvious but incredibly important benefit to the way the UK at least designed their capacity markets.
Yeah, that first one of, you get a government-backed contract and you can finance an asset. It did seem like it created a market in which you had more fragmentation. It wasn't just about big vertically integrated utilities. It was about, competition on the generation side, where someone who is just good at building a power asset or had a good grid location could do that as well. One other kind of non-obvious thing for me, Dan, is the whole, derating factors for renewables, right? So you look at how Great Britain derates renewables, and they give wind, I don't know what it is, 15% credit, and it just seemed to change the thinking where, the default was to think, well, wind's unreliable. I'm not going to build a power. I'm going to assume there's zero wind at peak. But actually the effort of going through the maths said, this is actually a reliable resource. Do you think this helped wind's credentials?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting argument, John. I think it links to another thing I was going to say, building on both Oliver's and Hugo's points about competition and the sort of surprises you get in there. Is actually, I think initially the regulators and policymakers like me at the time were surprised by what won. I think if you told a regulator, okay, it's going to build what you need, they said, great, we're getting 3 or 4 CCGTs then. And what won initially was peaking gas assets, and then we saw a wave of batteries coming in. And as you rightly say, as you start thinking the logic through and saying, well, actually, if we do the maths, how reliable is wind and solar? How likely is it to be there in a stress event? And actually, there is a credit you can give it. It's pretty small, and of course, you have to be quite nuanced about it because it shrinks the more wind you put onto the system or more solar you put onto the system. It's sort of very correlated. But I think it does change the debate, and it practically opens it up to new technologies as well as to new entrants.
It probably took a few years before the British government sort of accepted that new CCGT wasn't the right answer. There was a debate around that for a while. Sort of always be careful of politicians who like markets until they give the wrong answer. And I think arguably that's happening with marginal pricing in Europe at the moment. Okay, let me fire some criticisms of capacity markets at you. There seems like a fairly pro-CM crowd in general based on the conversation, but let me start, Hugo. Criticism 1. What would you say? System operators have a tendency to gold plate over procure. What would you say to that?
Yeah, and I think that's true, right? And we're seeing that play out in California, where I think they started with a 15% capacity margin. It's going up to 20-25%. And in addition to a capacity market, they're now also creating a $5 billion strategic reserve. So I think when you go down this path, it is very difficult to stop regulators, politicians, grid operators from over procuring. Now, that might be a price you have to pay for, for delivery of capacity market. but I think it's a valid criticism, and it's very difficult to resist. I think as the analysis gets more sophisticated as well, it's harder to push back in that, you can look at 1 in 10-year weather events, 1 in 30-year weather events, and the likelihood is you are going to find periods where renewable output is incredibly low for extended periods of time. So I mean, I don't know if there's an answer to that. It just seems to be part of the kind of political reality of introducing these markets into an energy system.
Yeah, I mean, the UK experience was interesting. They had this external expert panel, and I remember the press early on was, the government were getting whacked for over procuring because the expert panel said, look, if you haven't derated something as generously as you might or something like that, so you're going to spend some more money. So I have seen tension in the other direction, but it goes back to Dan's very early point of like the governance around capacity procurement and targets is pretty vital.
I was going to say I had a point to that because there's certainly an asymmetry about what type of blackouts we'll tolerate as well, because we don't do this, for example, on network failures to the same degree, and that is a political function, right? If people accept that the wind blows down overhead cables, they don't accept that you didn't have enough capacity on the system. Yeah,
no, for sure. It's just a massive, despite the fact that the value of lost load, the vol hasn't changed between those two. There's just if you're in an industrial economy, the lights, you shouldn't run out of generation capacity. Okay, so Dan, challenge criticism number 2 here, that capacity markets allow thermal generation, a fossil fuel emitting generation to stay on longer than they otherwise would. What would your response to that be?
Well, what's longer than they should stay on? I mean, we're in a transition, right? And something's got to keep the lights on. So I think the question is the capacity market designed in a way that favors those fossil fuel generators? For example, is it giving them long-term contracts that it's not offering to cleaner technologies, for example? So I'm not sure it's the capacity market per se, but there can be failings in the design of those capacity markets that skew it one way or the other. And as I think we've all said, it needs to be done alongside other decarbonisation policies. If you want to get high carbon plants off, you need to penalise them for emitting carbon.
Yeah. Okay. Oliver. So one challenge I sometimes hear, this is the third criticism, is that capacity markets try to solve their imprecise, instruments. They're trying to solve too many problems with the same mechanism. They're basically treating all gigawatts the same, whereas a battery has a much faster response than a coal plant. Storage can last longer than batteries. What's your response to that criticism?
I think there are just different markets for different purposes, and you have to think from the qualities that you would like in a power system, and then think what the optimal market design is to get there. And that's, that is probably some mix of capacity markets, energy markets, and ancillary service markets. If your capacity market is also trying to promote decarbonization and sort of a whole bunch of other goals, I think it's trying to do too much. And the market purist in me would say we have specific markets for specific purposes, and one mechanism cannot be counted on to do too much.
So there's a heuristic. If your capacity market is doing too many things, you don't have enough markets, or you don't have enough economic instruments. Basically, you need a new one. That's certainly the way the UK market seems to have gone in terms of broadening this suite of ancillary services markets around. Okay, Hugo, another criticism: capacity markets distort wholesale market price signals. What do you say to that?
I think it's both a criticism and, like, in some ways, one of the advantages. So a well-designed competitive market or capacity market actually should strip out some of the scarcity pricing from a wholesale market. And indeed, you should probably bring down your market price cap if you have a capacity market, because that value is in the capacity market. And some of the kind of less informed criticism of capacity markets I see in Australia, it basically says, well, capacity markets might cost us X, and the X, in my view, is rarely well calculated. And then they just add that to the wholesale market costs, and they say, well, that's a kind of net cost. When Aurora's done this work previously, we've thought hard about how much scarcity pricing might be stripped out of the wholesale market, the different discount rates that market participants apply to those different revenue streams, and then try to think about the total system costs. So yes, capacity markets will distort wholesale price signals, but market participants are smart. They'll adapt, and the value will pop up elsewhere. So again, I think it's a valid criticism, but in some ways it's not even a criticism. It's just a function of how the markets work, where you do have segmented markets pursuing different purposes.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so Dan, this is, I reckon, my toughest criticism. So I've saved it for you, which is they don't work as well in oligopolistic markets. We saw some pretty odd results in the Irish markets recently, where obviously you've got ESB as a dominant player there. So there, the argument is, look, you put everything into one metric where you've got someone with strong market power. I think we saw this in Poland as well, actually, from recollection. What do you say to that criticism? So you shouldn't be doing capacity markets in these concentrated markets.
Yeah, and it must be true at the extreme, right? There'd be no point running a capacity market in a monopolistic market. You basically need to regulate in that kind of world. But it isn't automatically true where there's some concentration. So there are various tweaks within the policy design about, for example, the size of bids, how you chunk up plants, what's visible, what people are allowed to see and bid into the auction to see whether or not you can actually exercise market power. But I think the general point is probably right, and it speaks to a point that sort of actually the flip side of the point Oliver was making about wanting to have different markets for different things, which is I strongly agree with, but it only to the point at which you've got enough liquidity and competition within those markets. So one of the things around, one of the debates around capacity markets, and they have it in Ireland, is a locational element, which is great. Obviously, you've got more granularity in what you actually want. But if you drain the liquidity from one of those locations, then you're getting market power to someone. So there's always the art of these kind of market designs, rather than the science, is judging that liquidity versus precision trade-off. And inevitably, they work slightly less well where there's market power.
Yeah. And of course, the same goes for the energy-only markets, in a sense, particularly with the nodal aspect. You get some very uncompetitive nodes sometimes, and that can play a role too. Okay, wonderful. Well, I want to wrap things up. I've got one other question, and I suppose this is directed at Hugo with the Australia cap on, and Oliver with the US cap on. And Oliver, maybe with a focus on Texas, because that's obviously where this debate is most live. So the question is, do you see a movement, irrespective of the merits, do you see a movement politically towards capacity markets in your regions? Or do you think there will be one there in 5 years' time? Might be another way to frame this question. So Hugo, can I start with you on Australia? Do you think we're moving in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a long, slow process. As long as I've been in Australia, the Energy Security Board and other regulators have been debating this. The Minister, Chris Bowen, has said he's moving forward. A report has been released. It looks like it's a bit more of a UK-style design at the moment. New and old can bid in. AEMO sets the target. Centralized auctions. But still lots of debate as to how this will work, and states being given license to do their own thing. The draft design is due in December 2022, and there's supposed to be a kind of final paper for ministers to decide on in Feb 2023. So it does feel like it's going in that direction, but there's a lot of, I think, kind of well-informed and perfectly valid criticism that's coming, particularly from the renewables community. And so, that battle will play out over the next 6 to 12 months. So I don't think it's a done deal yet, but it seems like that's the direction of travel.
Okay. And Oliver, to some extent, I can't believe I'm asking you this, but could you foresee 5 years from now a capacity market in, regulation light Texas?
Yeah, I think the words capacity market are as close to taboo as you can get for Texans. I mean, who I think are quite naturally proud of the energy only market design, which historically has performed pretty well. And there's a wariness, as you say, around government or system operator being the one to determine how much capacity gets built in the market rather than the market itself. I do think that two things have undermined that. One is naturally the February storm Uri in 2021, huge outages, really significant impact across the state. large political ramifications. And I suppose a broader trend as a second point would be just the increasing penetration of intermittent renewables. So Texas has already had a lot of wind on the system for a while. That's still growing. But solar is really just at the start of the boom. And that does start to lead to interesting pricing dynamics when all of that solar starts coming offline at the end of the day. So I think both of those things have prompted a broader question around market design. I think it would be going too far to say capacity markets are back on the table. One option that I think is under current discussion is the sort of load serving entity obligation that we've been discussing. So decentralized form of capacity payment that would be with obligations on load serving entities, and then they will procure bilaterally with generators. Some of the issues we've been talking around market design apply, right? So, is it transparent, or is it more like the Californian RA market? How does price discovery work? Do you give too much power to, big integrated gentailers who have a lot of generation and load to serve? So still a bunch of questions open and on the table, but I just suppose a final interesting point is just that, Texas, I think Hugo made this point earlier with regards to Australia, so that Texas is also not a pure energy only market. There already is government intervention, or at least influence in determining how much capacity gets built in the form of scarcity price adders. So, the lights aren't allowed to go out before scarcity pricing kicks in. As reserve margins are getting low, that's when you see those higher prices kicking in, and that's an indirect way for regulators to set how much capacity comes forward. It's just the specific terminology around capacity market, I think, is anathema here in Texas. I don't think we'll move down that sort of central procurement route with long-term government-backed contracts.
Okay, and if there is a decentralized one, it won't be called a capacity market. That wouldn't happen in the market. It's a bit like Australia, where you can't call something a carbon tax. You've got to call it a carbon pollution reduction scheme or something along those lines. You get into these debates around terminology.
John, just one final point before we wrap, and we haven't touched on this, but I do think in the abstract we debate design and efficiency, but I do think implementation and operation matter. And it's no surprise with Dan Monzani running the UK capacity market that it was well designed, communicated, and all those types of things. My concern in Australia is we're going to end up with a capacity market, but one that caters to different states. It's going to be complicated. The implementation might not be great. And therefore people will argue capacity markets were bad. Well, not necessarily, right? It is the implementation and operation. And there's no easy fix to that, right? It's having a high quality public service or system operator, whoever's administering it. But that really does matter, but I think is very under discussed in the literature, and even at kind of sessions like this.
Yeah, no, it's a great point and a great note to finish on. So we'll finish there. First, great that we could get the crew together despite the disparate locations for this. So thanks for joining, and to you each individually. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, Hugo.
Thanks, mate.
And finally, thanks, Oliver, for joining.
Thanks a lot.
That was John Feddersen, founder and chief executive of Aurora, talking to Dan Monzani, Aurora's managing director for Great Britain and Ireland, Hugo Batten, Aurora's MD for Asia Pacific and California, and Aurora's head of US, Oliver Kerr. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.